The tarmac at Bagram Airfield fell silent in a way that made even the ground crew uneasy. It was the kind of silence that preceded something catastrophic, the kind that made seasoned maintainers stop mid-wrench and stare at the sky. The radio chatter had gone dead 3 minutes ago, which in combat aviation terms meant either total mission success or complete disaster. No one was betting on success. The A-10 Thunderbolt II that everyone was waiting for had taken a surface-to-air missile fragment through the starboard engine nacelle 40 minutes prior, and the pilot had refused to eject. Protocol said punch out. Common sense said punch out. The aircraft commander had ordered her to punch out. Captain Reza Kaviani, call sign Nomad, had simply replied with two words that would become legendary in the 74th Fighter Squadron: negative, inbound. The story of how a 34-year-old single mother from Spokane, Washington, ended up flying the most damaged A-10 in theater history back to base started 6 hours earlier, when she'd been the subject of barely concealed skepticism in the morning briefing. Reza had transferred into the squadron 8 weeks prior from a stateside training unit, and the combat-hardened pilots of the 74th had made their assessments quickly. She was competent in the simulator, decent in formation work, but she carried herself with a quietness that some mistook for uncertainty. Her personnel file told a story they found unremarkable: 2 deployments to less intense theaters, no major incidents, no spectacular achievements. She'd taken leave twice for family emergencies related to her 7-year-old daughter. During crew rest periods, she studied approach plates instead of joining poker games. The other pilots didn't dislike her. They simply didn't think about her much at all. The mission brief that morning had been straightforward on paper: close air support for a Marine reconnaissance element operating near the Pakistan border, an area where the terrain was unforgiving and the enemy was experienced. 4 aircraft total: 2 F-16s for air superiority, 2 A-10s for ground support. Reza drew the wingman position, flying off the lead of Major Derek Castellanos, call sign Hammer, a pilot with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for aggressive tactics that somehow always stayed within acceptable parameters. The F-16s would be Viper 11 and 12, flown by pilots whose call signs Reza hadn't bothered to memorize yet. They'd kept their distance from her in the ready room, the same way most of the squadron had. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and light winds. Intelligence suggested minimal anti-aircraft threat. The Marines on the ground were experienced and disciplined. Everything about the mission suggested routine, which should have been the first warning sign. In combat aviation, routine was a myth that got people killed. They'd launched at 0630 local time, the dawn light turning the Hindu Kush mountains into jagged silhouettes against a sky that promised perfect flying weather. Reza had performed her pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision she applied to everything, walking around her aircraft with a focus that made the crew chief nod approvingly. The A-10 wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast. It was a flying tank built around a 30mm cannon that could shred armored vehicles like tissue paper, and it handled like a truck with wings. Reza loved it anyway, loved the brutal honesty of an aircraft that made no pretense about what it was designed to do. The flight to the target area took 40 minutes, during which the 4-ship formation maintained radio silence except for necessary communications. Below them, the landscape shifted from brown mountainous terrain to narrow valleys, where villages clung to hillsides like barnacles. Reza kept her position off Hammer's right wing, maintaining the proper interval, her eyes scanning her instruments and the sky in the practiced pattern every pilot develops. Altitude 11,000 feet, airspeed 280 knots, fuel state good, weapons systems green. The F-16s flew high cover at 20,000 feet, fast-moving guardian angels that could respond to threats with speed that the slower A-10s couldn't match. The radio crackled with the voice of the forward air controller, call sign Reaper 6. Hog flight, Reaper 6. We have troops in contact, grid November Victor 734289. Enemy forces dug in on ridgeline, danger close to friendly positions. Request immediate CAS. Danger close. The words that meant the Marines were so near the enemy that any munitions would risk hitting friendlies. It required precision that left no margin for error. Hammer's voice came back steady and professional. Reaper 6, Hog 1-1 copies troops in contact, danger close. Inbound from the south, 30 seconds. Hog 1-2 will hold high. Rizza acknowledged immediately. Hog 1-2, roger. She watched Hammer's A-10 break left and descend, beginning his attack run. The ridgeline came into view, a rocky spine that overlooked a narrow valley where she could see the tiny shapes of Marines pressed into whatever cover they could find. The enemy positions weren't visible yet, but the tracers rising toward Hammer's aircraft made them obvious enough. Small arms fire, nothing the A-10's titanium bathtub cockpit couldn't handle. Hammer rolled in, his cannon roaring in a distinctive brayap that carried even through her closed canopy, and the ridgeline erupted in dust and fire. Good hits, the FAC called. Enemy forces breaking cover, moving east along the ridgeline. That's when Rizza saw them. Not just the fighters on the ridge, but the technical truck hidden in the rocks 300 meters behind the fighting position. The distinctive shape of a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun mounted in the bed. It was already traversing toward Hammer, who was pulling up from his run and wouldn't see it until too late. Her decision took less than a second. Hammer, Nomad, break right, AAA your 7 o'clock low. She rolled her A-10 into a dive before he could respond, not waiting for permission or coordination. The Zu-23 swung toward her instead, recognizing the new threat. 23mm shells began reaching up through the air in streams of tracer fire that looked almost lazy until you remembered they were moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Rizza ignored them, focused on her gun sight, the pipper tracking across the target. The range wound down, 1,200 meters, 1,000. 800. The Zu-23 found her range. She felt the impacts more than heard them, sharp hammering vibrations through the airframe as shells tore into her right side. Warning lights illuminated across her panel like a malevolent Christmas display. Master caution, hydraulic pressure, engine fire right. She pressed the trigger anyway, and her own cannon spoke with authority that drowned out every alarm. The technical truck disintegrated under the sustained burst. Metal and bodies and ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that sent smoke boiling into the clean morning air. Target destroyed, she said calmly, as if she hadn't just taken catastrophic damage. Nomad is hit, assessing. Hammer's voice came back tight with controlled adrenaline. Nomad Hammer, say status. Rizza scanned her instruments with practiced efficiency that overrode the spike of fear trying to claw its way up her throat. The right engine was gone, fire light persistent despite her pulling the handle. Hydraulics were failing. Flight controls felt mushy and unresponsive. The aircraft wanted to roll right and descend, and it took both hands on the stick to keep it level. Her altitude was 8,000 feet and dropping gradually. She ran through emergency procedures automatically, muscle memory taking over while her conscious mind processed the tactical situation. Right engine fire unable to extinguish, hydraulics failing, flight controls degraded, maintaining controlled flight. She paused, doing the math in her head. Distance to Bagram, fuel state, rate of descent, the probability that her remaining systems would hold together. I can make it back. The aircraft commander's voice cut in from one of the F-16s. Negative, Nomad. Eject. We'll get a helicopter to your position. Rizza looked down at the terrain below. Mountains and valleys where a downed pilot could hide for days or die in minutes depending on who found them first. She thought about her daughter, Lily, 7 years old and living with Rizza's mother back in Spokane while Mommy was deployed. She thought about the promise she'd made before leaving, that she'd come home safe. She thought about the 17 Marines down there who'd needed that gun truck dead and were alive because she'd killed it. Negative, she said quietly. I'm bringing her home. There was a moment of silence on the radio, the kind where everyone listening knew they were witnessing someone make a decision that would either be heroic or fatal with no middle ground available. Then Hammer's voice, carefully neutral. Understood. Hog flight will escort. The next 40 minutes became a masterclass in aviation skill that no one except the pilots involved would ever fully understand. Razan nursed her dying A-10 toward Bagram with the patience of someone coaxing a wounded animal to safety. The right engine was completely gone. Fire burned out on its own after consuming everything flammable. The left engine was running, but she didn't trust it, keeping her power settings conservative and her movements gentle. The hydraulic system had degraded to the point where the manual reversion system was partially engaged, making every control input feel like pushing through mud. The F-16s bracketed her, Viper 11 and 12 keeping station off her wings in a protective formation that said more than any radio call could. Hammer flew ahead, coordinating with air traffic control and emergency services. Behind her canopy, invisible to everyone else, Razaf fought the aircraft inch by inch through the sky, making microscopic adjustments to heading and altitude, her hands steady even as sweat ran down her spine beneath the flight suit. She talked to the aircraft, a quiet monologue that no one else could hear because she'd been careful not to key the mic. "Come on, girl, just a little further. Stay with me. We're going home together, you and me. Nobody gets left behind." The Hindu Kush mountains passed beneath her with agonizing slowness. Her altitude bled off gradually despite her best efforts, 8,000 feet becoming 7,000, then 6. She adjusted course slightly north to follow the valleys where the terrain was lower, trading the direct route for survivability. The fuel gauge showed enough to make it with minimal reserve. Maybe, probably, if nothing else broke. At 20 minutes out from Bagram, the aircraft commander called her again. His voice had shifted, less command authority and more genuine concern. "Nomad, Viper 11. Weather is clear at Bagram, winds light. Emergency services staged. You still have the option to eject, we'll get you." "Negative," Razaf said. "I've got this." She did have it, through a combination of skill and determination, and something else that pilots rarely talked about but all recognized. The ability to merge completely with the machine, to feel the aircraft as an extension of yourself, to know instinctively what it needed and what it could give. The A-10 was mortally wounded, but it trusted her, and she rewarded that trust with perfect inputs and absolute focus. Bagram appeared on the horizon, the airfield complex sprawling across the valley floor. Razab began her approach from further out than normal, giving herself maximum time and distance to manage the descent. She called the tower, her voice still professionally calm despite the fact that every pilot listening knew she was flying something that should have killed her 20 minutes ago. "Bagram Tower, Hog 12, requesting emergency straighten approach runway 03. I have gear down, no flaps available, single engine, hydraulics critically degraded. Recommend emergency vehicles on standby." The tower controller's voice came back immediately, clipped and professional. "Hog 12, Bagram Tower, cleared emergency straighten runway 03. Wind 020 at 5 knots. Emergency services in position. Call the ball." Call the ball. The phrase borrowed from naval aviation, meaning confirm visual contact with the landing environment. Razaz scanned ahead, saw the runway stretching out like a promised sanctuary. Nomad has the ball. The approach required perfection. Too fast and the damaged landing gear might collapse on touchdown. Too slow and she'd stall and crash short of the runway. The flight controls were so degraded that she was essentially flying on manual mode, every adjustment coming from raw muscle input against control surfaces that barely responded. Her airspeed bled off as she descended. 200 knots, 180, 160. The ground rushed up with deceptive speed, perspective compressed by her focus on the runway threshold. At 300 feet she heard it, a sound like a gunshot from somewhere deep in the airframe, a structural member failing, something critical giving up after being pushed past all reasonable limits. The aircraft dropped hard to the right, trying to roll inverted. Reza hauled on the stick with both hands, her boots jamming the left rudder pedal to the stop, fighting with everything she had. The A-10 wallowed through the air like a drunk elephant, but it came back level. Barely. "Come on," she growled through gritted teeth. She crossed the runway threshold at 120 knots, faster than she wanted, but she'd lost the ability to slow down anymore. The main gear touched with a screech of tortured rubber. The nose gear came down. For one beautiful second, she thought she'd made it clean. Then the right main gear collapsed, the wheel assembly folding up into the wing with a metallic shriek that could be heard across the entire airfield. The right wing dropped and hit the concrete, titanium scraping against runway in a shower of sparks. The A-10 pivoted hard right, departing the paved surface and skidding into the dirt alongside the runway. Metal tore. Systems failed. The remaining engine finally quit with a sound like a dying breath. The aircraft slid to a stop in a cloud of dust and smoke. Emergency sirens wailed as fire trucks and ambulances raced toward the wreckage. Inside the cockpit, Reza sat motionless for 3 seconds, her hands still locked on the stick and throttle, her mind processing the fact that she was stationary, on the ground, alive. Then she moved with practiced efficiency, shutting down the remaining systems that were still powered, pulling circuit breakers to eliminate fire risk, preparing to egress. The canopy wouldn't open. The emergency system had failed. She could hear voices outside, ground crew shouting for tools. A hydraulic spreader tool bit into the canopy rail with a crunch of metal and composite. The canopy lifted away. Hands reached in to help her with the harness connections. She waved them off and released the fittings herself, accepting assistance only when it came time to climb out onto the wing. The gathered crowd of pilots, maintainers, and emergency personnel stood in a rough semicircle around the destroyed aircraft. No one spoke. They just stared at the damage, at the missing engine, at the collapsed gear, at the torn metal and scorched panels. Then they stared at Reza as she stood on the wing, looking smaller than she had any right to be next to the bulk of the wounded warthog. Someone started clapping, then another person. Within seconds, the entire crowd was applauding, the sound building to something that felt less like celebration and more like bearing witness. Reza nodded once, acknowledging them with the same quiet competence she'd shown in the cockpit, then climbed down to let the medical team do their assessment. She had a bruised shoulder from fighting the controls and her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fatting, but otherwise she was intact. Major Castellanos pushed through the crowd, his face showing emotions that rarely surfaced in professional military aviators. "Nomad," he said, and seemed unable to find additional words immediately adequate. "Did the Marines get out?" Reza asked. Hammer nodded. "All accounted for, 0 casualties. That gun truck would have shredded them if you hadn't." He gestured at the aircraft. "Jesus Christ, Reza, that was the finest piece of flying I've ever seen." The aircraft commander from Viper 11 arrived, a lieutenant colonel named Morrison who'd flown combat missions since the early 2000s. He looked at Reza with an expression that combined respect and something that might have been awe. "Captain Kaviani, I need you to understand something. I've been flying fighters for 22 years. I've seen a lot of good pilots do impressive things. What you just did wasn't impressive. It was impossible. You flew a dead aircraft for 40 minutes through mountain terrain, and then landed it with essentially no functional systems. The maintenance team is saying the only thing holding that plane together by the end was force of will." Reza shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "It wanted to make it home, I just helped." The debriefing that followed became the stuff of squadron legend. The intelligence analysts pulled the flight data recorder from Reza's aircraft and spent 6 hours mapping every system failure, every damage point, every compromised component. Their report concluded that by the final 10 minutes of flight, the A-10 should have been physically incapable of controlled flight based on the extent of hydraulic failure and structural damage. A test pilot from the evaluation squadron was consulted. His assessment was blunt. The aircraft's condition was incompatible with survivable operation. The only explanation for successful flight was pilot skill at a level that exceeded normal parameters. The word spread through Bagram and then through the entire theater. The single mom who'd been transferred in from a stateside unit, the quiet pilot that nobody had paid much attention to, had just pulled off something that would be studied in aviation safety courses for decades. The story picked up details as it traveled. Some accurate, some embellished, all converging on a single truth. Captain Rizakaviani, call sign Nomad, had refused to quit when quitting was the only logical option, and had brought herself and her aircraft home through skill and determination that defied normal human limitations. The nickname shift happened within days. She'd been Nomad because she'd moved between multiple assignments without settling, a bit of mild mockery that referenced her lack of combat pedigree. Now the call sign took on different connotations. A nomad was someone who survived in harsh terrain, who kept moving when others gave up, who found a path where none existed. It fit her in ways the original namers had never intended. The culture of the 74th Fighter Squadron transformed around her. The pilots who'd barely acknowledged her existence now sought her input during mission planning. The poker games during crew rest included a standing invitation. When new pilots rotated in, someone always made sure to point out Nomad's aircraft in the maintenance hangar, still bearing the scars of that flight, being rebuilt for eventual return to service. The story was told with reverence. This is the plane that refused to quit, flown by the pilot who wouldn't abandon it. Reza handled the attention with the same quiet competence she'd shown in the cockpit. She flew her scheduled missions, participated in briefings, studied her approach plates during downtime. The only visible change was that now when she walked through the squadron area, people nodded with unmistakable respect. The poker games turned out to be surprisingly enjoyable once she let her guard down enough to participate. She was terrible at bluffing but excellent at calculating odds. Her daughter's letters arrived weekly, crayon drawings and phonetically spelled words that Razak kept in a folder in her locker. Lily drew airplanes constantly now, stubby-winged A-10s with disproportionate cannons and trailing smoke that might have been engine fire or might have been clouds. The accompanying text, written with her grandmother's help, asked questions about flying and combat that Razak answered honestly but carefully, aware that a 7-year-old didn't need the full, unvarnished truth about what her mother did for a living. The maintenance team completed their damage assessment and presented it to Razak one evening in the hangar. Technical Sergeant Maria Okonkwo, a master maintainer with 17 years of experience, walked her through each system failure with professional precision that couldn't quite hide her amazement. The right engine had sustained multiple shell impacts that severed fuel lines and destroyed the turbine assembly. The hydraulic systems had lost pressure through 13 separate puncture points. The right main landing gear had been bent 30 degrees out of alignment by the Zu-23 shells, making its eventual collapse inevitable. Structural members in the right wing had developed fatigue cracks that propagated during flight, weakening the entire assembly. "Ma'am," Okonkwo said finally, "this aircraft should not have been capable of flight after the initial damage. The fact that you kept it flying for 40 minutes is—" She paused, searching for appropriate words. "I've been maintaining A-10s my entire career. I thought I understood what they could survive. You just expanded that understanding considerably." Razak examined the damaged components laid out on the maintenance stand, each one tagged and documented for eventual analysis by engineering teams. She touched the twisted metal gently, almost reverently. "She gave everything she had. All I did was not waste it." The squadron held a ceremony 3 weeks after the incident. Not an official awards presentation, but rather an internal recognition that carried more weight precisely, because it came from fellow aviators who understood exactly what had been accomplished. They gathered in the ready room on a Friday evening, the day's missions complete, the night's crew rest period still hours away. Someone had procured actual beer through channels that were probably best left unexamined. The squadron commander, a colonel who'd flown A-10s in Desert Storm, stood before the assembled pilots with a bottle in hand and words that had been carefully chosen. "We don't give call signs to be nice," he said. "We give them because they mean something, because they capture some essential truth about the pilot who carries them. Nomad started as a name that meant restless, unsettled, without a home. But a nomad is also someone who survives, who adapts, who finds a way when the way isn't obvious. Captain Caviani embodies that definition in ways none of us anticipated." He raised his bottle. "To Nomad, who proved that home isn't a place, it's a choice you make every second you refuse to quit." The room erupted in agreement, bottles raised, voices calling out in affirmation. Reza accepted the recognition with a nod and a small smile that suggested she was simultaneously honored and uncomfortable, the combination endearing her to the room even more. Hammer pulled her aside afterward, his expression serious beneath the celebratory atmosphere. "You know what you did changes things," he said quietly. "Not just for you, for everyone who comes after you. There are people who still think women don't belong in combat cockpits. You just made that argument considerably harder to sustain." Reza considered this, understanding the weight of representation even as she resented having to carry it. "I didn't do it to make a point. I did it to survive and complete the mission." "I know," Hammer said. "That's what makes it matter. You didn't grandstand. You just performed at a level most of us will never reach, and you did it when it counted." He paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry we didn't see it earlier. The competence was always there. We just weren't paying attention." The honesty of the admission meant more than elaborate praise would have. Razan nodded her acceptance. "We all have biases. What matters is what you do when you realize them." The conversation that followed ranged across topics that pilots rarely discussed directly. The invisible weight of being different in a community that valued conformity. The pressure of knowing that your failures would be generalized, while your successes would be treated as exceptions. The exhaustion of maintaining perfection because merely being good would be interpreted as validation of prejudice. Hammer listened more than he spoke, and what he said carried the careful consideration of someone genuinely trying to understand experiences outside his own frame of reference. The deployment continued. Reza flew more missions, each one routine in the way that combat aviation could never truly be routine. The Taliban learned to recognize her call sign and adjusted their tactics accordingly, which was simultaneously flattering and concerning. Intelligence intercepts revealed that local fighters had started calling her the ghost who won't die, a nickname that the squadron found darkly amusing. The Marines she'd saved sent a plaque through official channels, engraved with coordinates of the engagement and a simple message: "Semper Fi, Nomad." Her rebuilt A-10 returned to service 6 weeks after the incident. The maintenance team had repaired the damage with painstaking attention to detail, replacing every compromised component and stress-testing every system to ensure airworthiness. Okonkwo personally delivered the aircraft back to flight status, presenting Reza with the maintenance logbook and a grin that suggested professional pride. "She's better than new, ma'am. Try not to break her again." Reza performed a thorough pre-flight inspection, her hands traveling over panels and surfaces with practiced familiarity. The scars were still visible if you knew where to look, patches and repairs that told a story in rivets and aluminum. She signed for the aircraft and flew it that afternoon, a simple proficiency sortie that became more emotional than she'd anticipated. The A-10 handled beautifully, all systems responding with crisp precision, but Reza could feel the memory of that desperate flight ghosting through every control input. They'd survived together. The bond that created wasn't something easily articulated, but every pilot understood it instinctively. The deployment wound down toward its scheduled conclusion. Missions continued until the final week, when the squadron began redeployment preparations in earnest. Aircraft were prepared for transportation, Equipment was inventoried and packed. Personnel completed checkout procedures. The 74th Fighter Squadron's rotation had been successful by every metric that mattered. Missions accomplished, no aircraft lost to enemy action, no pilot casualties. The fact that they'd come close didn't diminish the achievement. The final flight out of Bagram carried symbolic weight that everyone felt but few discussed directly. Reza flew wing on Hammer's aircraft, the two A-10s departing in formation as the sun rose over the Hindu Kush. The mountains that had witnessed her survival now watched her departure, massive and indifferent and somehow eternal. She thought about the Marines on that ridgeline, about the gun truck that could have killed them, about the 40 minutes of flight that had seemed to stretch across lifetimes. "Beautiful morning," Hammer said over the radio, his voice carrying undertones of finality. "Affirmative," Reza replied, watching the landscape slide past beneath her wings. They flew in silence for a while, the comfortable quiet of pilots who'd shared danger and come to mutual respect. Then Hammer keyed his mic again, and his words carried weight that went beyond their surface meaning. "It's been an honor flying with you, Nomad." "Likewise, Hammer." The return to stateside operations felt anticlimactic in ways Reza had been warned about but couldn't fully prepare for. The forward deployed intensity of Bagram gave way to the routine structure of peacetime training assignments. She was stationed at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, flying training sorties, and serving as an instructor pilot for new A-10 pilots going through qualifications. The work was important but lacked the immediate stakes of combat operations. She struggled with the adjustment more than she'd expected. Lily was 8 now, taller and more articulate and filled with questions about deployment that Reza answered as honestly as she could. They lived in base housing, a small 2-bedroom unit that felt spacious compared to the cramped quarters overseas. Reza's mother had returned to Spokane, her temporary guardianship complete, and the responsibility of solo parenting settled back onto Reza's shoulders with familiar weight. School pickups, homework help, bedtime routines. The ordinary rhythm of domestic life that had seemed impossible during those desperate minutes over Afghanistan. The story of her flight followed her stateside, spreading through aviation communities with the persistence of true legends. Air Force Times ran a feature article. Aviation Week published a technical analysis. The video game community created a mission recreation in a popular flight simulator that Lily discovered and insisted on trying, her small hands gripping the game controller as she attempted to recreate her mother's achievement. She crashed repeatedly and with cheerful determination, utterly undiscouraged by failure. "It's harder than I thought," Lily announced after her 5th attempt. Reza watched her daughter line up for another approach, the simulated A-10 wobbling across the screen with erratic enthusiasm. Most worthwhile things are. The squadron dynamics at Davis-Monthan differed from combat deployment culture. The urgency was replaced with professionalism, the gallows humor with routine jokes, the constant alertness with scheduled predictability. Reza found herself missing aspects of deployment even as she recognized the privilege of that nostalgia. She had the luxury of missing it because she'd survived it, a fact that felt simultaneously obvious and profound. Her role as an instructor pilot brought unexpected satisfaction. Teaching new aviators the skills that had saved her life gave the knowledge a forward momentum, a sense that her experience mattered beyond the immediate moment. She was demanding but patient, pushing her students while recognizing their individual capabilities. Several of them were women, and while Reza refused to make gender a central focus, she understood the unstated significance of her presence in their training pipeline. One student, a lieutenant named Tors with exceptional situational awareness and a tendency toward overthinking, approached her after a particularly challenging training mission. They'd been practicing emergency procedures, simulated failures that Tors had handled competently but without confidence. The young pilot's face showed frustration with herself that Reza recognized from her own early training. "Ma'am, how do you know when you're good enough?" Tors asked. "When you're ready for the real thing?" Rizal considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. You never feel ready. You just reach a point where your training is thorough enough that you trust it to carry you through situations you can't imagine yet. The confidence comes from competence, and competence comes from practice. You're doing fine. But what if I'm not? What if I freeze when it matters? Then you recover and continue. Fear is normal. Panic is normal. What matters is what you do after the initial reaction. You can't eliminate fear. You just learn to function despite it. The conversation echoed ones that Rizal's own instructors had held with her years earlier, wisdom passed down through generations of aviators who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather the decision to act despite it. Torres nodded slowly, processing the advice with visible concentration. The young pilot would be fine, Rizal thought. She had the right instincts. Time and experience would hone them into reliable skills. The cycle of instruction continued through seasons. Summer heat gave way to autumn clarity, then winter chill, then spring's return. Rizal flew nearly every day, accumulating flight hours and instructor time that built toward qualifications she hadn't considered important until they appeared on her horizon. The rhythm of peacetime aviation had its own satisfactions, less visceral than combat but more sustainable across a career. The recognition from that flight in Afghanistan continued to accumulate. She was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony that felt simultaneously deserved and excessive. The medal came with a citation that used phrases like extraordinary achievement and complete disregard for personal safety that made Rizal uncomfortable because they implied choice rather than necessity. She hadn't been brave. She'd simply been unwilling to accept the alternatives available. Lily attended the ceremony in a dress she'd insisted on wearing despite Rizal's suggestions that casual clothing would be fine. The 8-year-old sat in the front row with Rizal's mother, watching with solemn attention as the base commander pinned the medal to her mother's uniform. Afterward, Lily was allowed to hold the medal, her small fingers touching the bronze star with reverence that made Rizal's chest tight. "You're a hero," Lily said with absolute conviction. "I'm a pilot who got lucky," Rizal corrected gently. "Nope, hero." There was no arguing with 8-year-old certainty. Rizal accepted the designation with a hug that lifted her daughter off the ground. The medal pressed between them like a promise that some things were worth fighting for even when fighting seemed impossible. The years accumulated. Rizal progressed through ranks and assignments, each position building on the foundation established by that single flight. She commanded a flight, then served as an operations officer, then took command of a squadron herself. The leadership positions came with responsibilities that extended beyond personal flight performance, requiring skills in personnel management and strategic planning that she'd never expected to need. She adapted, applying the same methodical competence to paperwork and personnel evaluations that she'd once applied to emergency procedures. The A-10 community remained relatively small, a tight-knit group of pilots who'd chosen the ugly duckling of fighter aircraft over sleeker alternatives. They gathered at conferences and reunions, swapping stories and maintaining connections that transcended official duty stations. Rizal's flight became part of the community mythology, one of the stories that defined what the airframe could survive and what pilots could accomplish. New A-10 pilots heard about Nomad during their initial training, the single mom who'd refused to eject and had brought her plane home despite impossible damage. Some of those new pilots were women, their numbers growing slowly but steadily as the military's final combat exclusions fell away and cultural attitudes evolved. Rizal watched this progression with quiet satisfaction, understanding that each woman who succeeded made it marginally easier for the next one. Progress was incremental and fragile, requiring constant proof that should have been unnecessary but remained essential anyway. A documentary filmmaker approached her when Lily was 12, requesting interviews for a project about women in combat aviation. Rizal initially declined, uncomfortable with attention that felt like exploitation. The filmmaker was persistent but respectful, explaining that the goal wasn't sensation, but rather documentation of changing military culture. Eventually, Reza agreed to a limited interview, on the condition that her daughter could veto any content before publication. The interview took place in her living room rather than on base, a deliberate choice to emphasize the normalcy of her life beyond the uniform. The filmmaker asked thoughtful questions that went beyond the dramatic narrative of the flight itself, exploring the years of training and preparation that had made survival possible. Reza found herself talking about her own instructors, about the crew chiefs who'd taught her to respect the aircraft, about the culture that had slowly shifted from skepticism to acceptance. What do you want young women considering military aviation to know? The filmmaker asked. Reza thought carefully before responding. That it's possible, that it's hard, that being good isn't enough, you have to be undeniable, and that's not fair, but it's currently true. Also that you're not alone, even when it feels that way. There's a community and it's growing and we're all invested in each other's success. The documentary premiered at a film festival 18 months later and eventually appeared on a streaming service where it found an audience beyond military circles. Reza watched it once, found it well executed and uncomfortable in the way all representations of oneself feel, and then largely forgot about it. The impact rippled outward in ways she didn't immediately see. An uptick in women applying to pilot training programs, increased attention to the experiences of female service members, conversations about institutional bias that gained traction precisely because they were grounded in documented achievement rather than theoretical argument. Lily was 14 when she announced her intention to become a pilot. The declaration came during dinner, delivered with teenage certainty that brooked no disagreement. Reza felt simultaneous pride and fear, understanding exactly what that path would require and what challenges it would present. She didn't try to dissuade her daughter, but she didn't romanticize the choice either. It's a calling that will demand everything from you, Reza said carefully. It's also one of the most rewarding things you can do with your life if you're built for it. Are you sure? Completely, Lily said. The conversation that followed covered practical realities, the years of education required, the physical demands, the reality that military aviation was a career that left limited space for other priorities. Lily listened with the focused attention she'd inherited from her mother, asking questions that demonstrated she'd already done substantial research. The determination was evident, and Reza recognized it because she'd felt the same pull at a similar age. The years of Lily's high school passed with the usual mixture of challenges and achievements. Reza tried to maintain balance between supporting her daughter's ambitions and ensuring she had a complete adolescence beyond preparation for military service. Sports and friends and school dances happened alongside flight simulator practice and physics tutoring. Lily was accepted to the Air Force Academy, her application strengthened by genuine achievement rather than family legacy, though Reza's reputation certainly didn't hurt. The day Reza drove Lily to Colorado Springs for in-processing felt momentous in ways that were difficult to articulate. Watching her daughter take the oath of enlistment, understanding that this was the beginning of a path that would shape every subsequent choice, Reza felt the weight of circular time. She'd been the young woman standing at attention once, filled with determination and ignorance in equal measure. Now she was the parent watching, carrying knowledge of what that path entailed. "I'm proud of you," Reza said during their final private moment before the formal in-processing began. "And I'm terrified for you. Both things are true." Lily hugged her fiercely. "I know, I'll be careful, I'll be competent, I'll make you proud." "You already have." The drive back to Arizona felt longer than the drive there had. Reza found herself thinking about legacy, about the way choices propagated forward through generations, about whether she'd adequately prepared her daughter for the challenges ahead. The questions had no clear answers, but the asking itself felt important. Parenthood was an exercise in delayed consequences, trusting that the foundation you'd built would prove sufficient for tests you couldn't predict. The years continued their progression. Rizal was promoted to colonel, taking command of an entire operations group that encompassed multiple squadrons and hundreds of personnel. The position was primarily administrative, taking her out of the cockpit more than she preferred and into conference rooms where strategic decisions were made. She adapted as she'd always adapted, finding satisfaction in enabling others to achieve excellence even as she missed the immediate feedback of flight. Lily thrived at the academy, her grades strong and her athletic performance solid. The culture had evolved since Rizal's own time, integration more complete and overt hostility less common, though challenges remained. Lily navigated them with a combination of competence and quiet refusal to be diminished that reminded Rizal of herself. The parallel was both comforting and concerning. The A-10 community faced ongoing uncertainty during this period. The aircraft was old, expensive to maintain, and vulnerable to modern air defenses in ways that newer platforms weren't. Arguments for retirement were countered by arguments about capability and close air support requirements. The debate became existential for pilots who devoted careers to the airframe, understanding that every weapons system eventually reached obsolescence but resenting the timing. Rizal found herself advocating for the A-10's continued relevance during budget discussions and strategy sessions, using her own flight as evidence of the aircraft's resilience and capability. The arguments were received with respect, if not always agreement. Eventually, a compromise was reached: gradual retirement of the oldest airframes while maintaining a smaller fleet for specific mission sets. It felt like losing something important even as it acknowledged practical realities. Lily graduated from the academy with honors and entered pilot training, beginning the pipeline that would determine whether her ambitions matched her capabilities. Rizal maintained careful distance during this period, aware that her daughter needed to succeed or fail on her own merits without parental interference. The updates came through letters and occasional phone calls, Lily's voice carrying excitement and exhaustion in varying proportions. The first time Lily soloed an aircraft, she called Rizal immediately afterward, her words tumbling over each other with adrenaline and joy. "Mom, it was incredible. Everything you said about the responsibility and the freedom and the way it all comes together. I understand now." Rizal felt tears she hadn't anticipated building behind her eyes. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Yeah, that's it exactly. Welcome to the community." The career progression continued for both of them, parallel tracks moving through rank and qualification. Lily specialized in fighters, selecting F-35s rather than A-10s in a choice that disappointed Rizal not at all. The newer aircraft represented capability that matched contemporary threat environments, and Lily's aptitude for the advanced systems was evident in her training reports. She was building her own reputation, separate from her mother's, and that separation was healthy even when it felt like distance. Rizal reached the point in her career where retirement became a realistic option rather than distant abstraction. She was eligible, her service record exemplary, her pension secured. The question became what she wanted the next chapter to look like, whether continuing to serve provided meaning or whether it was time to step aside for the next generation. The decision felt weightier than it probably should have, complicated by identity questions that arose when you defined yourself by a profession for decades. The choice crystallized one afternoon when she was visiting the maintenance hangar, ostensibly to review readiness reports, but actually because she missed being around aircraft. Technical Sergeant Okonkwo, now a senior master sergeant with silver in her hair, was supervising work on one of the remaining A-10s. She recognized Rizal immediately and approached with a smile that suggested genuine affection beyond military courtesy. "Ma'am," Okonkwo said, "good to see you. Heard your daughter's tearing it up in the F-35 program." "She's doing well," Rizal confirmed. "Takes after her mother in all the important ways and improves on her in several others." They walked the hangar together, talking about aircraft maintenance and personnel challenges, and the way the Air Force had changed over their combined decades of service. Eventually, the conversation circled back to that flight, as conversations with Okonkwo inevitably did. The maintenance chief had kept one of the damaged panels from Rizaz's original aircraft, mounted on a plaque with the mission date engraved beneath. "Still the most remarkable piece of flying I've witnessed in my entire career," Okonkwo said, gesturing at the artifact. "And I've seen a lot of pilots do impressive things, but that was special. That was someone deciding the outcome they wanted and refusing to accept alternatives." Rizaz examined the panel, running her fingers over the torn metal and patched repairs. "Feels like a lifetime ago." "It was, sort of. You weren't a colonel commanding an operations group then. You were a captain flying wing. Everything that came after, all of it, stems from those 40 minutes. Makes you think about legacy, about what we leave behind." The comment stayed with Rizaz through subsequent days, crystallizing her thinking about retirement timing. She had one more contribution to make, one more way to ensure the lessons of her experience propagated forward. She began drafting a training curriculum focused on emergency decision-making, using her flight as a case study not in heroism, but in systematic problem-solving under catastrophic conditions. The curriculum emphasized that survival wasn't about being fearless. It was about being methodical when fear was most acute. The proposal was accepted by Air Education and Training Command. Rizaz spent her final year in uniform developing the program, working with instructors and aviation psychologists to create training that would give future pilots tools for managing the unmanageable. The work felt important in ways that administrative leadership hadn't, a direct connection between her experience and others' future survival. Lily was there for the retirement ceremony, taking leave from her own duties to attend. She wore her dress uniform with the same attention to detail her mother had always demonstrated, stood at attention in the same way, carried herself with the same unconscious confidence. Rizaz saw herself reflected in her daughter and saw differences that represented improvement, evolution, the way each generation refined what the previous one had established. The ceremony was held at Davis-Monthan, where Rizaz's career had taken its most significant turn. The A-10 she'd flown that day had been retired from service by this point, but photographs of the damaged aircraft were displayed prominently. The base commander spoke about service and sacrifice and achievement, using phrases that felt appropriate even if they made Rizaz uncomfortable. Fellow pilots attended, some of them traveling across the country to be present. Hammer was there, retired himself now but still carrying the bearing of a combat aviator. They embraced with the affection of people who'd trusted each other with their lives. The final speech fell to Rizaz, the traditional opportunity for the retiree to address the assembled crowd. She'd prepared remarks but found herself departing from them, speaking instead from the collection of thoughts that had been accumulating over months of contemplating this transition. "I've spent 23 years in uniform," she began. "I've flown aircraft in peace and in combat, trained pilots, commanded units, and tried to contribute to something larger than myself. The moment most people remember from my career lasted 40 minutes. But that moment was only possible because of the thousands of hours before it, all the training and preparation and learning from people more experienced than myself. We focus on dramatic events because they're memorable, but real competence is built in the accumulation of ordinary days when nothing spectacular happens, but the work gets done anyway." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm proud of my service. I'm proud of this uniform. I'm proud of the communities I've been part of. But what I'm most proud of is standing here knowing that the next generation is already surpassing what my generation accomplished. My daughter is one of them, but so are hundreds of other young pilots who are better trained, better equipped, and better supported than we were. That's progress. That's the legacy that matters." The applause that followed felt genuine rather than obligatory. Rizaz stood for a moment, accepting the recognition while simultaneously ready to step beyond it. The ceremony concluded with the traditional final salute, the base commander rendering honors that Reza returned with precision that had become muscle memory over 2 decades. Then it was done. Colonel Reza Kaviani retired. The transition to civilian life carried the expected dislocations. The loss of daily structure, the absence of clear mission objectives, the sudden expanse of unscheduled time. Reza had prepared for this intellectually, but found the emotional reality more challenging. She consulted with military transition programs, connected with veteran support networks, gave herself permission to struggle with the change. She found purpose eventually, as most successful retirees did. The training curriculum she developed evolved into a broader consultancy, working with aviation companies and military training programs to improve emergency decision-making protocols. The work leveraged her expertise while allowing flexibility her previous career hadn't permitted. She could attend Lily's change of command ceremony when her daughter took her first leadership position. She could travel without requesting leave. She could pursue hobbies that had been theoretical during active service. The hobbies revealed themselves gradually. Photography, specifically aviation photography, capturing the beauty of aircraft in flight with skills refined through practice. Writing, drafting a memoir that explored the interior experience of combat aviation rather than just the external drama. Teaching, occasional guest lectures at universities and military academies where she could share hard-won knowledge with students who reminded her of her younger self. Lily's career flourished in ways that brought Reza satisfaction that felt more profound than her own achievements had. Watching her daughter command respect through competence, build teams through leadership, navigate institutional challenges with intelligence and grace, Reza felt the particular pride of a parent who'd provided foundation without dictating trajectory. Lily was her own person, making her own choices, building her own legacy. The documentary about women in combat aviation became the subject of academic study, used in military sociology courses to explore cultural change within institutions. Reza occasionally received messages from young women who'd been inspired by her story to pursue aviation careers. The messages were gratifying and overwhelming in equal measure, a reminder that individual actions sometimes carried weight beyond their immediate context. On the anniversary of that flight, Reza made a private pilgrimage to Davis-Monthan's boneyard, where retired aircraft were stored in the desert climate that preserved them. She found her original A-10 among the rows of stored airframes, its damaged sections still visible beneath the cocoon of protective coating. She stood beside it for a long time, remembering the desperation and determination of those 40 minutes, the way the aircraft had given her everything it had, the bond that had formed between pilot and machine in crisis. "Thank you," she said quietly, touching the scarred metal. "We made it home together." The sun set over the Arizona desert in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of Afghan mountains. Reza watched the light change, felt the temperature drop with the approaching night, and acknowledged the fullness of a life lived with purpose and courage and occasional terror. She'd survived what should have been unsurvivable. She'd raised a daughter who was even better than she'd been. She'd contributed to progress that would outlast her individual achievements. Lily called that evening, as she'd started doing on significant dates once she'd learned their importance. "Hey, Mom, thinking about you today, about that flight." "Thinking about you too," Reza replied. "About the pilot you're becoming, about the ways you're going to exceed everything I accomplished. I learned from the best." "You're learning from everyone which is smarter than I was at your age. That's the point. Each generation should be better than the last." They talked for an hour, conversation ranging across personal and professional topics, with the comfort of people who trusted each other completely. Eventually, they said their goodbyes, and Reza ended the call feeling connected to something continuous, a thread that ran from her instructors through herself, through her daughter, through students yet unknown, all of them contributing to capability that mattered. The years ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities, the natural progression of a life transitioning from primary action to advisory role. Reza approached them with the same methodical competence she'd applied to everything else, understanding that retirement wasn't ending but transformation. The title would be different. The daily structure would be different. But the core identity remained. Someone who refused to quit when quitting seemed rational, who found paths where none seemed to exist, who earned respect through demonstrated excellence rather than demanding it through assertion. Sometimes, late at night when sleep was elusive, Reza returned mentally to those 40 minutes over Afghanistan, not with trauma or regret, but with wonder at the confluence of preparation and circumstance that had made survival possible. Every training flight had mattered. Every instructor's lesson had contributed. Every system check had built toward the moment when accumulated competence became the difference between death and survival. The legacy wasn't the dramatic event itself, but rather the patient accumulation of skills that made the event survivable. Her story would be told for decades, probably generations, in ready rooms and training facilities where pilots gathered to share the folklore of their profession. Some details would be accurate, others embellished, the whole narrative taking on mythic qualities that obscured the scared woman in the cockpit who'd simply refused to accept the obvious conclusion. That transformation from reality to legend was inevitable and perhaps even useful, as long as the core message remained. Competence mattered, preparation mattered, refusal to quit mattered. The single mom from Spokane who'd been underestimated by her squadron had become a colonel and an institution, had raised a daughter who was becoming a better pilot than she'd been, had contributed to cultural change that made the military more capable by making it more inclusive. The achievement was significant even as Reza remained uncomfortable with lionization. She'd done what the moment required with the skills she'd accumulated. Others had done similar things, would do similar things. Her story was important but not unique, representative but not singular. On clear mornings, Reza sometimes drove out to the mountains that ringed Phoenix, found high places where she could watch military aircraft conducting training missions in the valleys below. The A-10s were fewer now, being gradually replaced by newer airframes. But they were still there, still doing the mission they'd been designed for, still proving that survivability sometimes mattered more than performance specifications suggested. She watched them with the affection of someone who'd learned the aircraft's capabilities through extremity, who'd felt it give everything to bring her home, who'd honored that gift by living a life worthy of the survival it had enabled. The aircraft were machines, sophisticated collections of metal and systems and engineering. But in the moment when survival hung in balance, they became something more, became partners in a dance where both participants needed the other to survive. Nomad had come home, the aircraft had come home, the mission had been accomplished, the Marines had been saved, her daughter was thriving, the story had been told and would continue to be told. The legacy was established not in medals or ceremonies, but in the incremental progress of pilots who came after, who flew with competence that built on lessons hard learned, who understood that the real heroism was in the preparation rather than the crisis. Sky remained vast and beautiful and occasionally treacherous, calling to those who couldn't resist its challenge. Reza had answered that call once and answered it well. Now she watched others answer it, carrying forward capability and courage, and the stubborn refusal to quit that defined military aviation at its best. The work continued. The story continued. The legacy continued, propagating forward through generations that would push further and achieve more than their predecessors, as every generation should. In the end, the measure of a life well lived wasn't the dramatic moments, but rather what those moments enabled afterward. The 40 minutes mattered because of the decades that followed, because of the daughter who exceeded her mother's achievements, because of the pilots who learned from her example, because of the institutional change her success helped catalyze. The legacy wasn't Reza Kaviani herself, but rather what her competence had made possible for others. And that legacy would endure long after the stories stopped being told, woven into the fabric of an organization that was stronger because it learned to recognize excellence regardless of where it came from. That was more capable because it expanded rather than restricted its pool of talent. That was more resilient because it valued demonstrated competence over comfortable assumptions. Nomad had come home, and in coming home had helped ensure others would have that same opportunity, would be evaluated fairly, would be given the chance to prove themselves in the moments that mattered. The achievement was simultaneously personal and institutional, individual and collective, specific to one flight and applicable to thousands that would follow. The sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in colors that promised beauty and danger in equal measure. Rizal watched it with satisfaction earned through decades of service and sacrifice, with peace that came from knowing she'd contributed meaningfully, with hope for the generation that would carry the work forward into futures she couldn't predict but could help enable.